So yeah, so Sacha, I just have so many questions about the your contribution and your own background and interests. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your own sort of trajectory, and where you're heading and what you're bringing to this work, because there are a lot of questions that I have. And before I do that, I want to give you an opportunity just sort of to introduce yourself and tell us kind of what brought you to this whole concept of queer convivial futures.
Yeah, great. Thanks for asking. Yes, I can say a bit about how I came to that combination of things, so to say. It's a number of things that came together, kind of, connections or relations that came together and became interesting for me to contribute to this process of this book. And one of them was, while I was researching and interested in artistic approaches and artistic research on ecological issues, I came across queer ecologies at some point, and this connection between ecological thinking, ecofeminism, and queer theories, which was really interesting. Also connecting to some practices such as sex ecology from California, Annie Sprinkle, and so on. And then, so that was all very interesting, got me more interested actually to look more into queer studies, queer theory, because I am a person who, in terms of private life, was all very much into all of that, but in terms of academia, I was more into my ecology, sustainability thing, and then a kind of interesting connections. And then a few years later, but around the same process, around the same period of years, I also came across, thanks to actually a German guy who was doing also a publication on that, I was made aware of the Convivialist manifesto, right, of this movement of convivialism. Which was, I had the first manifesto, which was really mostly France-based, so interesting, but still a little bit culturally specific, let's say, or regionally specific. But then, the conversations opened up, and they had more recently a second one, which is much more international and had corrections. But still, my feeling was there's a lot of nice things in that convivialism discourse and a lot of good things, but I was missing some of the qualities of queer theories, of queer ecology, of process of queering in this convivialism. And when you were engaging into this book on creative futures, I thought that combining the two, combining this convivialist project and qualities of queering could be an interesting way to an interesting angle on the question of creative futures.
Great, thank you. Yeah, you have there's a quote of yours that I particularly like, which is related to transdisciplinarity, which is an interest that we share, and that I think, given the fact that anything having to do with sustainability by definition spills over any kind of disciplinary borders, right? So you can be interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, or I think, maybe the three of us have a preference perhaps for transdisciplinarity in that sense. But you say cisdisciplinarity is an approach to disciplinary knowledge that mistakes a given discipline for an access to a complete knowledge of the world in one of its dimensions, ignoring that a discipline can merely contribute a fragmentary and situated knowledge on one dimension of reality, right? Which I think is a very interesting quote, and kind of puts a key idea in a nutshell, as it were, right? It sort of caps, and I think maybe that reflects to, in a way, what you found with that conviviality approach, right? That it was sort of lacking to some extent.
I would not put it so harsh on conviviality. I would not
on
say
the conviviality, yeah.
I wouldn't say convivialism or convivialism, because conviviality is again slightly different. But I wouldn't say the convivialist manifesto or the group is cisdisciplinary, not at all. It's very much involving all sorts of approaches. So I can say a few before I come back to convivialism.
Sure.
Cisdisciplinarity. I liked, I like playing with words. Like some of us like, playing around with words and making up new terms. Of course, that's the fun of it. There's also a reason, and the reason is that it's not just about condemning disciplines, because very often people who do important work in different disciplines feel they are puzzled, or they might even feel threatened by the transdisciplinary discourses. And this is really to make clear that there is nothing wrong with with knowledge and with insight that can come from disciplines, as long as this knowledge is situated. So that's right. In a way not so new. It's what feminist discourses have been in science have been saying for many decades. It's something that so feminism and then queer studies have been saying for a long while. I'm just borrowing this term trans and cis from transgender discourse in order to actually reuse a bit that kind of way of speaking to reflect on the question of transdisciplinarity and contrast it not to disciplines which have a value, but on a certain attitude, a certain approach, which an approach to the disciplines which I would call cisdisciplinary, and that will when relate to a certain kind of normativity, the same way in queer theory you criticize hetero and you question and you disrupt heteronormativity or patriarchal or other forms of normativity. In the same way, I think so that's the idea behind it. But when it comes to Convivialist International, I wouldn't say that this is the issue. The issue is more that actually, from what I read, and once again, this is just the manifesto itself, or the first version, and there's many more writings by Convivialists, which probably go in various directions. Sure. But in those specific texts, I'm really seeing a relatively traditional binary notion of gender. I'm even seeing a kind of paternalistic discourse, almost in a discourse in which I'm caricaturing, but it almost says something like, well, in some parts of the world, it's okay to have less feminism and less rights for women because it's cultural difference. And, a kind of for me, very unsatisfying and simplistic aspect within the discourse where I'm missing the values of critiques coming from or reflection coming from the whole ensemble of queer studies. So that's the point. But it's not a disciplinary versus inter or transdisciplinary problem. Right. It's really a problem of in the case of a manifesto, it's really a problem of the questions of sexuality, gender, and also more generally. And that's another issue which I think has to do with the process of queering. I think that there is an issue with the way the manifesto or the Convivialist manifesto seems to still cling on to what seems to be still quite fixed and fossilized identities in a way, like communities, identities. And what I like with queer thinking is that this is, of course, valuing the importance of identification, but also looking at disidentification. Or if we talk like Edgar Morin, who always said like de-reorganization, de-re-identification as kind of complex process and not just identities. And that's something where I think it's not, even though Morin is part of the Convivialist International, actually, those aspects I'm missing a bit maybe in some parts, maybe not the whole text, but some parts.
Yeah, great. In your chapter, before we come back to the issue of identity, because I thought that was very interesting your discussion there and your use of Morin in that context. I'd like to come back to the 6 points that you make about queering, right? Which I think also would be interesting for the audience to get a sense of, right? Because I think it's both original and provocative, and also sort of instructive in terms of understanding the overall perspective. Could you tell us a little bit about the 6 points that you made there?
Yeah, I will. To be honest, I will have to look back into. I have it right next to me. That would be helpful to look back into the page. I mean, the part of the chapter where they are, because I don't know them by heart fully. But
no, and I think that's actually an interesting point, because sometimes we write these things and then we sort of forget them, but of course other people read them, and we said, that's interesting. Well, look at Kagan is writing this, and it's like, and you're going, let me look back and see what I actually wrote. Right. So I think that's
and of course it is something which is merely a kind of synthesis or putting together ideas from many other queer studies,
sure,
which I just try to put together in one little summary, so to say. So the first of the 6 has to do with perceiving. So queering as perceiving the real as unstable, and something in becoming, and also perceiving norms, perceiving the norms that are enforced, the norms that frame the real, and this is a connection to Nicolescu, because we like Nicolescu. I often also make these connections. Frame the real within specific levels of reality, and from the notion of levels of reality. So that would be a first one. To perceive, to be queering is to gain this perception of those things, of those issues, and of those norms. And then second level would be from perceiving to actually have queering as questioning. So queering as questioning the fact that these norms, these things that are becoming, but are seen as stable, as actually seen as stable, too much seen as stable, also too much seen as taken for granted, as if they were natural.
Right.
So by questioning that, showing that there is an instability, like making aware that there is an instability of those things. And this is something which is related to what we just discussed, this notion of situated knowledges that comes from Haraway and feminist thinking, that allows us to see that this instability. Then the third one is the idea, and that's really more connected to the research that comes from people like Michel Foucault and so on, the idea of a genealogy. So that's the idea that you don't just perceive and question the norms, but you try to start digging. You're like an archaeologist, this idea of archaeology, of culture, of idea. You try to unearth whatever the context of the emergence of those things that we take for granted. So that's a third way of querying. The researching way of querying, in a way. And then a fourth one is to challenge, on the one hand, processes of normalization, of homogenization, and to while doing that, so challenging those processes of normalization, to uphold the subjects in their multiplicity and in their indeterminacy. So it's more an active, I would say, aspect of it, from the research to the kind of active, or the starting of an active process of querying. And connected to that is something else, which I think is connected, but still I have it as a fifth point, which is a kind of creative process, a process of invention, of inventing. Querying as inventing modes of life, modes of being that are other, that are, or in the way Wendling Küppers talk about it, he also plays with words. He talks about other / or other minus wise. So otherwise, like otherwise, but also otherly wise, and also wise with and about others, and etc. etc. So there's work between the wordplay between other and wise. So this is, the fifth point would be the invention. Dissolving the kind of path dependencies of trajectories that would follow, certain normativities that are dominant in society, and trying to foster the emergence of bifurcations of things which are strange, like strange temporalities, as some queer theories talk about, or forms of life which are imaginative and which should not fit in the norms, or even also other forms of economic practices, queer thinking has also been used in queer feminist economic theory to look at all those economic practices that do not fit within the frame of a traditional way of thinking of capitalism. So that would be the fifth one. It's the inventive, and then of a creative aspect. And then the sixth one would be the most activist, I would say, and this is really here queering as resistance, queering as resilience, queering as saying we don't want to fit in, we don't want to be the homonormative to the heteronormative, for example, which would be, or the transnormative to the heteronormative, which would be to kind of fit in within the frames of the dominant normativities, or maybe what Sardar would talk, who is also having in your book having this nice interview with you and Gabrielle, this notion of colonized imaginations. So really trying to resist against that, and to try to develop what it's Caffeine Jessie. Caffeine Jessie is a sex educator and also an ecological artist, and had many other passions and works and areas of work based in Vancouver. And Caffeine Jessie was or is writing in one of her texts about radical disharmony with various sites of oppression, so concerning gender, morality, patriarchal, nuclear family, culture of nature, white racial supremacy, to name but a few. And here, I'm going to stop here, but just last little point here, especially Jessie is interesting because she's saying that we should not shy away or negate the stereotypes that are put on minorities to kind of castigate them, but actually look deeper inside those stereotypes and find archetypes which are radically in disharmony with dominant normativity and gathering radical learning opportunities actually for social transformation. So to kind of dig in the stereotypes to find something much deeper inside, which would be archetypes, which would be very productive.
Yeah. That's fantastic. That's actually an entire sort of research and an action agenda there. One last thing, and then I'd really like to open it up because we have Nick here, who is, I think, extremely knowledgeable about these issues, and I think it'd be wonderful to bring her into the dialogue. The whole issue of identity that you discuss and your use of Morin in terms of the whole and the part. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think that's an issue that's sort of up right now as people are thinking about the future, and it's tricky at this point to, in many ways, feel like it's not possible to go beyond sort of a fragmentation, right? That everything is kind of fragmented, and there's this sense of a lack of unity and a suspicion of unity in a way. And at the same time, I think you handle this in a very good way that both addresses the problems but offers some different ways of thinking about it.
So thanks also for pointing to that aspect. There's maybe one thing I can mention, which is not in the text itself, but since it's a bit of a context we provide with this kind of conversation.
Sure.
Hopefully people will read our book and look into some of the details by themselves. But one thing I noticed is that on the one hand, it looks like, and you have to correct me because you probably know more about Morin than I do, but I have a feeling that in Morin there is missing some consideration for feminist insights or feminist research, and later on queer studies, queer theory, of course, that came later historically. So maybe one can say, okay, it was a bit late for him, maybe I don't know, but still feminist insights are missing. And on the other hand, same thing the other way around. But that's more generally for Anglo-Saxon world, despite the great efforts of people like yourself and to kind of be bridges between Morin's insights and those of the Anglo-American world. Still, much of the queer studies and theories has, or at least as far as I know, has not made a single connection to some insights from Morin, where actually I think there are a number of things in Morin which are, in his way of thinking, which are very potentially fruitful when they are bridged or put in connection with queer thinking. So I think there are really valuable resonances there that we should harvest or point to and work with. And these are, and some of them I'm trying a little bit to point to or to describe in that chapter. And I think it's one of the concrete things I'm pointing to is the idea that it's just one of the many really fruitful ideas of Morin, but it's the idea that the whole is both more and less than the sum of its parts. And this I think is a good way to keep in mind that when we think of emerging new or old or re-emerging collective identities. We're always talking about things which are at the same time potentially or really emancipatory and repressive. We don't have to choose, or we don't have to say either there's an emancipatory process or there's a repressive process. This is a process that is both emancipatory and repressive when we are talking about these issues of collective identity. So I think that's one point where Morin's one of his general principles is kind of helpful to keep that in mind, and therefore to connect to the notions of disidentification, for example, from the queer theorist José Muñoz, for example.
Great, thank you. Nick, would you like to come in with any reflections, comments, thoughts?
I mean, I love the chapter. I love the ideas you're working with. I actually want to get your email address. Alfonso, I'll probably get it from you because I want to get a PDF copy of your chapter. I have the book, of course. I read it in my author copy of the book, but I'm just in the early stages of putting together an anthology on neuroqueer theory and practice. And I don't know if you're familiar with neuroqueer theory, but it extends queer theory into the realm of neurodiversity. And I think I want to give contributors your chapter to read. I've got a whole bunch of readings I want to send to the contributors. It really has struck me around identity. The discourse on neurodiversity has been really intensely kind of stuck in a very essentialist identity politics. And so part of my intent with neuroqueer theory is applying queer theory and fluidity of identity, fluidity of self, identity as something that one performs rather than something that one is in a fixed way. And so it's been very hard to convey that to contributors. I'm swamped with chapter proposals. It is exciting just how many chapter proposals I've received, but half of the ones I received, I rejected right away just because the authors could not see beyond the framework of essentialist identity politics, and it is really striking how stuck in that people are. That even when given this very explicit instruction of let's see what creative possibilities lie outside of the framework of rigid fixed identity politics. There's a lot of people, including academics who regard themselves in many cases as very radical and progressive, who can't get outside of that framework.
Nick, sorry to interrupt. Could you, just for the larger audience who may not be aware of exactly what that means, could you just give a quick sort of definition and explanation of what you mean by essentialism and identity politics in this context?
Right. So by identity politics, I mean it in the broadest sense of people identifying with identity labels, having specific social identity labels around their race, their sexuality, their nationality, and regarding those as reflecting essential internal qualities of who they are. And there's a very us and them vibe to it, and a sense of scarcity to it, a zero-sum game idea. So I see it as very divisive, and I see this as kind of pervasive across the political spectrum too, because of course the right-wing politics are entirely about identity politics. They're entirely about nationalism and white supremacism very much about specific, racialized and nationalized identities, but then leftist politics too has become less about solidarity of the working class, which is what the left more used to mean, and much more about these very specific racial groups and sexual and gender identity groups. And the essentialism aspect of it, again, is seeing these identities as fixed and innate, like because you were born this nationality or with this skin color, you are automatically a member of this culture and are expected to have these particular qualities. And or I mean, the big example, of course, in queer, from queer theory, is this idea of you're either gay or straight. If you're gay, it's because you're born that way. And this was a stage, a big stage, and kind of the gay rights movement and formation of gay cultures. This idea, oh, we're born that way, and queer theory really came along to challenge that, and to say it doesn't matter if you're born that way. Like, we shouldn't need to say that to justify what our sexual practices are or what our gender is. This is it's not about we were born this way, but it's about this is what we do. Gay because we have gay sex, gay because we do gay love, and Judith Butler really shaped a lot of that around gender. That gender is not something you are, that you're born with based on the shape of your genitals, but it's a social performance that can be queered. It can be changed and modified and taken outside of the assigned limits of socially approved gender performance. So yeah, right. So that's what I mean.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one short. I perfectly follow what you're saying. Maybe just one short point, which is about one term, maybe the term of fluidity, and that's the only term where I would make a little kind of a note of warning. Especially, I think it's at some point Judith Halberstam who writes about that at some point, about the fact that the notion of fluidity can also sometimes give the impression that it would be an easy thing, that going against this dominant norms would be an easy thing because it's fluid, and especially nowadays in our society would be also fluid. It would be so easy, but actually it's a difficult thing. So it's it's important to keep that in mind, and to make sure that there's not a misunderstanding of this kind of image of fluidity. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's very important, that the fluidity is, and this is, I mean, and my work is around this combination of, neuroqueer theory and somatic work. And that's where, because Butler talks about gender as embodied performance. This is something that we do, that is made up of performed, internalized acts that we learn. And it is, in fact, difficult to actually have fluidity and to actually change the self and to change the culture. And so my own work is very focused on why is it difficult? And how does one actually create that fluidity? Because it is difficult. It's not an easy thing to do, because these things are very deeply ingrained and internalized, not only culturally, but within individual bodies. And so I'm very interested in the bodily process of how do you change that? This is ongoing, and part of this is this ongoing personal project for me, is that my own gender transition, I decided to start somatically, like before even considering hormones or surgeries. What does it mean to remove the conditioned masculinity from my embodiment without doing it medically, just doing it from the inside out. And that's an ongoing adventure that's really interesting to explore. And it involves this deep, took me deep into the work of Wilhelm Reich and removing deep bodily tensions. And like, wow, this stuff really gets deeply locked into place. So it's definitely not easy. And I love a challenge. So a lot of my work is about how do we do this thing that isn't easy?
Oh, what you're saying makes me think of one aspect, because in this chapter I also talk about spaces of possibility and space of potentiality, and I think it would be really interesting for me to try to think a bit more about this in connection to those embodied change processes that you just described. How do those relate to possibilities which are in the body, which are, so to say, prefigurative embodiments, which are already kind of in process, or where you see things that can be, corporeally developed, and where it might be more like potentialities. So potentialities that are much more subtle, much more difficult to unearth, and therefore only exist as a kind of horizon of potentiality, but not so much as a current possibility. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And this is very much what what my own work has come to be about. As well, and that I talk about the horizon of possibility a great deal, in my work, and yeah, it is always. I'm an optimist. I'm always looking at how do we make this possible? How do we open up further possibility? But it definitely is. It requires very specific approaches. It requires sort of a whole technology of self-transformation, and then also there's this concurrent cultural transformation around it, which is another thing that I'm very interested, something that I address in my own chapter in the book too, where I'm not talking about queering, but just about the somatic work, but that there's sort of been this, I think, a false dichotomy around sort of the neoliberal focus on individualism and then a more collective focus. But I think that the work has to happen in both directions. That I see people getting very focused on only making individual change. And that leads to sort of the cultural narcissism that's so especially prevalent in the USA. And then I see people though trying to make collective change without the individual change, and I think that one can't really do the creative shaping of culture without becoming the sort of person who can participate meaningfully in that and who can be in the new culture. It doesn't matter if we break down the gender norms in a cultural way, if people are still carrying those norms in their body. And so the work has to happen concurrently. How do you reshape the culture for greater liberation and to open up new creative possibilities? But how do you also simultaneously reshape the bodies in order to be participants in that culture?
And another aspect I think relates to or a correlated aspect maybe relates very much to something that also Alfonso and Morin and before them the Taoist tradition very much highlighted, this idea of thinking of those complex dualisms, also for example gender, instead of having either this binary, this kind of heteronormative binary of a gender, or a naive version of non-binarity, which would be like some kind of, I don't know, neutral or non-gendered, but to really actually see the richness of this duality, which is a complex duality in this tradition of complexity, which has several roots. Yeah,
there's something alchemical about it. There's some exciting alchemy about taking not a split duality either or, but recognizing a polarity and how you get the chemistry between the two sides of the polarity and start mixing and playing with it.
it's a very complex issue, isn't it? And I mean, I'm noticing just also in the general discourse, kind of a lot of confusion, and also we're seeing politically, I mean, everywhere from China, where Xi Jinping seems to think that the Korean pop stars don't represent a good Chinese model of masculinity, right? To obviously here in the US, but in a lot of different countries and continents. I mean, from Africa to Asia, there is sort of this what's clearly a form of backlash to changes in the way gender is conceived beyond sort of this binary opposition in a way, right? Where I am a boy to the extent that I don't do girly things, and girls are girls as long as they don't do boy things, right? Because that's where we go beyond sort of an apparently natural order, right? And so could you talk a little bit about what your perception is, Sacha, maybe of this sort of the way that this has created a backlash, but also sort of some confusion, because I think we're looking at things that people mostly haven't looked at in their daily lives, you know. Mm-hmm. And so it's very new, and it's sort of somewhat shocking, and and
it's also very historically rooted and has a lot to do with the processes of westernization or globalization, or however you want to call it, with lots of perverse effects that have been going on. It's a bit difficult to, but I can mention two examples quickly. I simplify a little bit, but just two examples.
Sure.
One of them has to do with this notion, and we just heard about it in Uganda in the last law, these notions of queer lives being un-African. It's perverse in a way, since if you look at it historically, it is the Christian and European colonization that brought the modern form of definitions of heterosexuality and homosexuality and all the other ones. You know, these are modern notions. These are not notions that always existed. These are also historically situated notions that came, which were developed at the same time as modern anti-Semitism, modern racism, and this all intersectional things. So these are things that came to Africa through the colonization process, and which are themselves, one could say, very much un-African. So that's just one example. The other example is, if we look back historically at different forms of, for example, right now I'm doing a research project on Jewish culture and Jewish heritage and queering Jewish heritage. So that's the new thing that I'm looking into, especially in the case of Europe, because in the US there's a lot that has been done and a lot of interesting things going on for decades. But in Europe it's a bit a different situation. But looking at that, there's been really good research by, for example, again, a US researcher called Daniel Boyarin, who was looking into the construction of Jewish masculinity in relation to the construction of this kind of Christian, dominant European masculinity. And in this kind of example, one can see the very complex interrelations between the constructions of idealized gender stereotypes or forms, for example, of masculinity that are considered valuable, for example, in this case, in the European context, as opposed to other forms of masculinity, or in the case of Jewish people, also of femininity, which are cast as not properly, like a kind of feminine diaspora Jew, etc. So, the learned Jew, etc. So there's a correlation between all those things. So between this kind of gender norms, between the norms of that create an idealized kind of Christian culture versus what is cast out from a kind of anti-Semitic perspective, and then even more complicated. And that's something I'm not even really started to read, but people I interview tell me I have to pay more attention to. One can also relate it to the very complex relationship between coloniality and gender and the Jewish experience, which has been, shifting and having a complex relationship in between, Europeans, white European, Christian Europeans, and colonized people of other parts of the world. So it's a very complex thing, and gender is caught in the middle of all of that. So there's historical context which have to be taken into account in each. For example, in China, it would be also a specific historical context, which I don't know anything about and very ignorant about that, but still, but still connected to that, all the influence of this global Europeanization, colonization processes, etc., which all have played a role in how gender has been, normed or normativized. Oh, sorry, my English is getting bad. And when looking at all of that, then it can help to contextualize or to historicize and then to relate to the issues and how there is how then the putting in question of gender norms also kind of shakes several other structures, and therefore it's threatening a whole lot of other things too, and not just gender. Yeah.
Right. So there's a sense that, in a way, it seems like gender is sort of a linchpin kind of in the potential unraveling of society, right? And I mean, there's a sense that some people have, I think, that if you pull there, then everything is going to fall apart. I mean, that it seems like I get that, there are obviously some key issues, but it seems like gender is very potent there in the sense that it can, that it seems to affect people at a very deep level, and for some people that an unraveling of that aspect is parallel to sort of an unraveling of society and the natural order. Do you get that feeling too? I mean, it's certainly elicited a very strong reaction, hasn't it? The shift away from binary.
Oh yeah, I mean, the intense, violence of the backlash with when gender, when binary gender norms are threatened. I mean, it's really extraordinary to see. And I mean, to me, that's a sign. Oh, we've hit on something. We've hit on something real. We've hit on something meaningful. I mean, there's there's so many things that people do that are sort of token gestures toward liberation. The sort of the neoliberal corporate co-opting of diversity that doesn't generate really a huge backlash because it doesn't really have the power to make much of a change. It's when something comes along that actually does threaten the status quo and can create a change. And so you can kind of measure the something's potential to create positive change by what kind of backlash it gets from the people who are against positive change. But I think also this speaks again to the interconnection of body and society, that the people who are reacting so strongly and so violently to the challenges to rigid gender norms, they're talking about it like, oh yeah, all of society will fall apart. And of course, I think it will, in fact, break down societal rigidities and allow positive change to occur, which in the eyes of some people might be regarded as falling apart. But it's the good kind of falling apart. But what I see is that this resistance, this intense, violent reaction is happening in the body, that people, as we noted before, these gender norms are embodied. and they're deeply ingrained in the body in what Wilhelm Reich called the character armoring. And I can tell you, having done some deep, intense Reichian work on my own body and other people's bodies, there are points in that work where it's breaking down aspects of the sort of characterological rigidities that one has come to identify with, and it feels like death in a way. It feels like a dying to do that much letting go, and it's a dying so that something more beautiful can be born. But I think that the visceral reactions we're seeing in like anti-trans hatred and such are these people on a largely unconscious level contemplate letting go of their own gender rigidities, and it feels like death to them. And they feel on a deep unconscious level like they're fighting for their lives.
Yeah. Well, and it's no surprise, I suppose, that Wilhelm Reich wrote a book on the mass psychology of fascism, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's a very fruitful avenue for research, and I think at the same time, we have to recognize also that the backlash has also been very much against women too. I mean, if you see some of the legislation that's being passed here, Sacha, I don't know if you're familiar with some of the sort of draconian and really misogynistic kind of legislation that's being passed here about abortion and things like that. It's really mind-boggling in the effort to sort of reassert a certain kind of very clearly a binary hierarchy, of course, because it's not just binary, it's a hierarchy, right? And so it's a very dramatic moment in a sense historically, right? I mean, it's a real challenge to see how we can participate and create futures that are more sort of embracing and generative and open, right? So yeah, I think between the two of you, there's lots of work there. And Sacha, you were going to say something.
Yeah, well, while just listening to what Nick was saying, it made me think of what I was just hearing. So I'm in Tunis. I'm in that event, which is about the climate crisis as a crisis of imagination at La Rue in Tunis. And one of the persons who was intervening earlier today, Uhuru Palafala, she was at some point, I'm looking back from my notes, but she was at some point saying she was saying lots of very beautiful things in her intervention. But one of the things she said was, at the very end, she was concluding that intimacy is the antidote to fascism. And I found it really a nice point really there. So this kind of interconnected and resonant way of which allows to find ways outside of fascism and know this kind of.
Yeah, well, remind me to ask you for her name afterwards, and so we can. Yeah. So we're heading towards the end of the hour here. Sacha, any concluding words? Any words of wisdom as we close down here?
Oh wow. What could we add to the rest? Well, the one thing, one of the interesting, maybe it's just I just pick one thing that I found nice from all those insights from queer researchers that I've been very happy to be reading. One of them is this notion of this queer art of failure from Halberstam again, and it is sometimes to purposely to activistically almost or to in a popular cultural way fail to perform according to certain norms can be a way to to also be active. So not just to achieve certain things, to also, you know, fail to live up to certain standards. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting.
They call it, I mean, Halberstam calls it the queer art of failure. It's one of his earlier books from, I think, a decade ago, but really nice. And also, this also implies, you know, a lot of a sense of humor and of certain attitudes to the work that has to be done, which is I think helpful.
Yeah, I like that. I like that, Nick. You and I could probably relate to, and I think actually this is a part. There was an author by the name of Robert Anton Wilson and the whole Discordian movement, which is really all about humor, but also about change and also about turning some preconceived ideas upside down with humor in a way that is that doesn't take itself too seriously and doesn't get too invested in its own ideas.
Exactly. And also taking this paranoid way of thinking, turning it into kind of part of a fictionalized, you know, the work of Wilson, you know, this kind of Illuminati, all sorts of things, and to really kind of hijack the paranoid way of thinking, which exists everywhere, which also exists in queer theory, everywhere, and to kind of, you know, hijack it or détournement to bring it to the reparative way of working that, for example, another queer writer, Cedric, talks about, that she was trying about, you know, trying to not just do critical work, which is important, but also the reparative work, which requires that we engage in the humor, that we engage in those less satisfactorily coherent things. That brings us again to complexity, chaos, working with indeterminacy, incoherence,
and failure, as you said, right?
Serendipity, failure, inefficiency, redundancy, all this. It's like, you know, all these, let's say, the right way to understand resilience, or what I would call the right way to understand resilience, versus the very, very wrong way to understand resilience.
Yeah, I like this because, I mean, I think one of the things that we've probably all three of us noticed is sort of a certain hyper seriousness when addressing these issues of global, you know, disaster and of course all the you know, very problematic and horrible things that are happening in the world. And at the same time, you know, since all three of us are interested in creativity, we also know that creativity and thinking beyond this, which is desperately needed, requires humor and openness and playfulness, which I think also all three of us have plenty of. And maybe that's one of the binaries, the serious, playful, you know, now we're being serious, don't fool around, right? Now is the time to break that down and say, hey, you know, we're in deep shit, and it's time to, you know, really be serious about being playful and creative, right? So yeah. Well, great. It's great to have you here, Sacha, and Nick. Thank you for being here too.
I'm so glad I could be here, Sacha. It's so great to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Nick, and thanks a lot. And also thanks a lot, Alfonso, and you made a great conclusive word. I mean, I really loved it.
Well, I hope you and I can stay in touch even at a distance now that it's, you know, obviously so easy. So let's stay in closer touch. I have some things I want to ask you that I'll email you about, and yeah, let's get into some playful projects.
Great.
Thank you both very much. Thank you, Sacha.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.